Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Preswick, and I'm pleased to be joined by Peter James from amaysim. If you can't hear me, it's probably because you don't have headphones in. They should be attached to you, so I'll give everyone a minute to plug in and listen in. But today we're going to be talking about future-proofing a cloud security operating model and what CNAPP is. CNAPP stands for Cloud Native Application Protection Platform, and why we're seeing this as a new operating model. Before I get into it, we're going to start off with some introductions, primarily from Peter's side, what his role is, what you're doing at amaysim, and then I'll dive into what CSPM is and how it's morphed into CNAPP and how amaysim's doing it in their own journey. Then we'll go into amaysim and what we're seeing as a modern operating model with a focus on the amaysim journey. So before I do, Peter, could you tell a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Peter James. I've been a technology leader for about 10 years, but as you can see, there's some career highlights on the screen there. That computer that I picked up at a garage sale did not ever work quite the same, but I definitely got a DOS prompt, I think, at some stage. Really passionate about all things automation, cloud engineering, and of course security. My role encompasses all of those, including networks and platforms. I'm not looking for a job, but if you want to connect, my LinkedIn's up there and it's on the back as well. Generally, when people put that up, they're looking for a job. It's not me at the moment. I love where I work. And yeah, I've been at amaysim for it's almost 9 years to the day, actually. Our CTO presented at a keynote that long ago. But yeah, who are we? We are a values-led MVNO, which to us means we have 4 values which we really decide on how we choose products, platforms, or decisions for our customers. And we're serving almost over 1.5 million customers these days as well, which is a surprise to a lot of us because we don't have huge brand recognition. We were fast cloud adopters, but we weren't born in the cloud like a lot of people that are here. We've got our share of monoliths running on EC2, we've got a bunch of containers, and we've got some of the more modern workloads which are running on CDK or serverless as well, and sort of everything a bit in between. So that means we've got a very broad sprawl of a cloud infrastructure. It's all on AWS these days, but we haven't had the success of scaling the team at the same size we've scaled our cloud infrastructure as well, which is where we look at tools like Wiz and other things to help.
Awesome,
That's
thanks
us.
Peter. Yeah, and before we go into amaysim more specifically, I do want to get everyone kind of on the same page a little bit about what is CSPM and what is CNAPP, and they're not just more acronyms in the alphabet soup of security, but effectively we've got Cloud Security Posture Management, and then the new kind of avenue or area that Wiz is kind of categorized in, which is Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. So one of the kind of, I would say, origins of this platform, and I want to hear amaysim's journey in this as well, is ultimately the fact that the cloud's changed everything through a few different domains, I would say. Number one, new environment. So obviously we've decentralized in terms of the operating model that we're running. We're moving away from self-hosted. The shared responsibility of who's owning what has introduced this new environment, and therefore potentially new risks around that. And then you've got multiple architectures. You've got the ability to introduce Kubernetes, containerized, serverless, all these different avenues, and then naturally that's going to introduce more risks. So what we're seeing a little bit is things like, identity layer is a whole new domain of external attack surface that we need to be monitoring, on top of the traditional things like network vulnerabilities and malware. And with the new risks, obviously we're going to have a new operating model there as well. New operating model means new ownership. No longer do application teams need to work directly with infrastructure necessarily to be able to get their applications going. They can spin up an AWS account or an EC2 server, take that real benefit of the cloud and being able to move fast, but naturally that's a new ownership model, so how do we get security in that way? And Peter, it'd be interesting to hear, I've kind of made a few bold statements here. Tell us a little bit about amaysim's cloud journey, strategy, and so forth.
Yeah, so we, as I said, we didn't start in the cloud, but we were early adopters. And what we found is that means that there's everything, from a security lens, everything from developer misconfiguration or engineering misconfiguration, all the way through to nation state attacks or other hacks as well. It also means that the pace of change is huge. Even though we were early cloud adopters, how we used our cloud infrastructure 8 years ago, 9 years ago is very different to the workloads and how we lean on things today. So it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that does unlock a lot of opportunities for us to leverage different platforms and bring better customer experiences to light.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say there around that. That's kind of that balance of when you've got all these new capabilities within the platform, and what we're seeing a little bit, and a potentially smaller security team that hasn't been able to potentially maintain that scale of cloud adoption, and it's a fairly common thread, and once again, why the kind of explosion of CNAPP in this space is being seen, and it primarily for a couple reasons. One, we're seeing a huge growth in technologies, services, as you mentioned, the rate of acceleration and releases is, and the benefits of that AWS and cloud providers bring is that ability to move fast, develop, iterate fast, and all that. But what we're seeing is a potential, let me see if this animation works, a security team capacity being able to start from maintain it in the early days when we do transform, but as it explodes, how do they maintain that? And Peter, you mentioned some of those potential elements of potential accidental mistakes, blind spots, and so forth. So this is where we're seeing a scaling cloud security model is imperative in today's world, because naturally a security team has to share the load within application teams as well. Before I go into some of the challenges and how you're addressing these, I do want to kind of just give everyone what CNAPP actually is. So CNAPP is essentially a singular platform that is aggregating a lot of traditional scans, misconfigurations, external attack surface, but also bringing in things like vulnerability, malware assessment, sensitive data analysis, but then adding in cloud nuances as well. So identity and secrets, things that traditionally haven't been done on-prem as sufficiently as what we're seeing in the cloud. The kind of key markers of a CNAPP platform is being able to aggregate and prioritize these particular alerts. Now, what are the kind of legacy approaches when it comes to cloud? And I'll go into the amaysim, how they're addressing some of these challenges in a moment, but ultimately we've got is a CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management. It was around identifying misconfigurations. An EC2 instance has a public IP address. But one of the things these miss is context. So what this, you'd be right to assume that this is a public machine, considering it's got a public IP, but it might not even have an internet gateway associated with it. So without that broader context, more or less, it's not specifically a false positive. It does have a public IP address. It's a false risk though. And these are the different avenues that we're seeing. And then another example of it, it goes the other way, where you've got a false negative in the sense that an EC2 instance doesn't have a public IP address, therefore your CSPM tool won't be notifying you to this. And you think, okay, we're all hunky-dory, it's not public, but it could be behind a load balancer, and you've got all these contextual elements that without a CNAPP platform, you're going to start to miss. I suppose the takeaway in these types of things, and this isn't just for misconfigurations, it's an example of alerts in isolation without bringing context. Vulnerability is the same thing. What I'm saying here is misconfigurations don't always equal risk. Okay, and this is like the morphing of the language that we're using when it comes to cloud security. Alerts are not the same as issues. You can be alerted to a lot, but are they an issue or a risk issue to the business? And this is where some of the challenges with those traditional CSPMs come in. Lack of context, noise without prioritization, operational inefficiencies. Peter, a few challenges I mentioned. What are you seeing at amaysim? How are you addressing these?
I mean, it's very true. Like the biggest challenge when you're running like a high rate of change, like we're up to sort of probably 200 production releases a month, give or take, is the rate of change and the rate of attack surface changes massively. You also don't want security to just be a blocker and just say, right, you have to fix every single vulnerability in the account before something else will go live. That's not the kind of team culture we have, but it's also not the kind of security team or the security culture we want to build, and culture is a huge part of what we want to do. And what's important to us. So making sure that we're giving a curated or a prioritized list to our engineers or to our infrastructure guys and girls to really make sure that we're reducing our security risks, but also not just saying security is just a big no button, you can't pass go. As a general rule, engineers want to do the right thing, unless they're working on some kind of Linux library for 2 years and trying to inject a threat in a really clever way to be paid for open source. But generally engineers want to do the right thing. So we want to help that, and we want to use tools and practices and processes that help them do the right thing in an efficient way.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear. The culture piece is obviously huge, and before I go into some of the new operating model that amaysim is really adopting at the moment, we often hear the classic thing of security enforcing a new tool on developers, which I'm kind of like getting an idea is what is kind of happening potentially with Wiz bringing in. How do you balance like the security objectives with the kind of delivery items. How are you doing that at the moment?
Yeah, so the key thing for us is we want to introduce tools or processes that will help engineers build more secure software. So we want to introduce tools or processes that engineers will have buy-in. So part of that is, and it sounds really straightforward, is getting them on board really early on, saying, hey, we're about to trial new widget XYZ or new security tool XYZ. Who wants to be part of that, and who wants to really come along for that journey and help make developer experience part of the decision criteria as well. We want to put tools in place that developers actually want to use or engineers want to use, which I think is a key reason for success in putting in a new tool, rather than just saying, hey, we've got this new thing, it says you've done a terrible job for 10 years and here's the 3,000 vulnerabilities you need to fix by tomorrow.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I'll kind of go into a little bit about Wiz's approach here. And I'll be keen, Peter, to get your insight in terms of how that adoption's been within amaysim. But ultimately, Wiz started as kind of like that cloud infrastructure assessment, bringing in vulnerabilities and all that type of stuff and contextualizing it. We have broadened out to bring in the developer experience, bring those insights so they can self kind of serve and assess their infrastructure before potentially deploying it into runtime environments. And then more importantly, if there was to be a live threat, being able to respond to it in a fast way. You kind of alluded to what I think was the latest backdoor from XE utils. Obviously a very high profile threat. Some interesting insights on XE utils that we saw. In our customer base, we saw, I think, 100% of customers had some form of the XE library in place, the compression library in place. Thankfully, it wasn't too effective in terms of the distros that it was on, I think less than 2%. But say, for example, like Log4Shell or other high-profile threats, how does amaysim do that? We didn't have Wiz when Log4Shell happened. How did you address XZ?
Yeah,
Talk us through that.
So I guess it's a huge difference. And I think one of the key challenges, as we said, was prioritization. And there's potentially so many security distractions, as well as really like core security vulnerabilities that you need to try and solve for. When Log4Shell came out, our approach or our response approach was a lot of spreadsheets, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. And that was, so we were really in spreadsheet hell. Okay, what version do we have? What's the mitigation? Is it patch? Has the vendor already got a patch? Do we do something ourselves? Is it exposed to the internet? All that kind of stuff. With XV, I went into, a team went into Threat Center in Wiz and said, right, okay, we actually don't need to do anything because of XYZ, but we had that context of, here is our environment, here is the tool we've deployed that knows, more about threat intel than we can do. We just scan RSS feeds, which punch into our Slack instance. So now we've actually got a threat intel feed that actually is contextualized inside our environment, which scans daily for us to know what our exposure rate is and what things we need to prioritize and what things we can actually say, yeah, that's fine, we're good. We don't need to spend any time or effort, because engineering and security time and effort is one of the most valuable commodities we have.
Are you seeing when these kind of events happening, what's the security function here? Are they becoming like a consulting arm internally? Do the development and engineering crews kind of like self-serve this information? How's it being distributed at the moment?
So right now, it's probably both. So
Okay.
we have a really engaged set of engineers and cloud engineers that are on top of a lot of this stuff and are on call 24/7. But we also have a relatively small security team that will also help drive behavior to say, hey, what about this? Tools like Wiz and others allow us to sort of bridge that gap a little bit, so eventually we can get to, we firmly believe that engineers should own their code all the way through to production. Tools like Wiz allow us to sort of eventually move that all the way to engineering without it being a huge imposition or without it really being a big problem, because eventually we can get to it before it's an issue. So
Yeah, very
eventually that's part of it.
Yeah, okay.
We're not there yet.
The future state of that as well.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about how Wiz is working in terms of the capabilities that we're kind of delivering at the moment and the kind of future state, and how we're seeing with customers like amaysim, how you can get that high adoption when it comes to the cloud security findings that we've got. So firstly, Wiz is a SaaS-based platform, and effectively what we're doing is every organization gets a dedicated tenant and they connect into their respective cloud provider. So in AWS, you deploy at the organization level with a role, and that's it. There's no extra kind of production impact, there's no agent. And it has a reader permission essentially that allows you to scrape all the APIs and then go a little bit further and snapshot the actual instances. And as you can see on the screen here, we extract a lot of those traditional findings. You've got things like external exposure, misconfigurations, as I mentioned. So you're bringing them all in together. The snapshotting mechanism is really interesting because essentially you get everything on the data plane on the workload without an agent. How was the deployment at amaysim for Wiz? We obviously did a trial last year or so, about a year ago now.
Yeah, no, and I think the agentless approach, and I know there is an agent-based approach as well, but agentless approach was really key for us. A, to help have a low effort trial, but B, also to sort of reduce our exposure risk as well. So especially with our environment, like we don't have, we don't have all of our workloads on EC2. So even an agent-based approach would be a challenge for us. Having something like Wiz, which we can install relatively easy, start to gain real insights. And we were actually going through a, shall we say, some kind of security response when we trialed it.
Yeah.
So we're actually able to use it in anger straight away without worrying about deploying extra versions to machines or changing machines that might be in a state of incident response.
Compromise, right. Very interesting. And one of the ways we kind of prioritize the detections that we've got there. So you can see there's quite a lot of alerts potentially that we're pulling in. Of course, you can kind of go into the depth of all that if required, but ultimately it comes down to prioritization, as you were mentioning, right? Like, how do you prioritize so the team knows what to focus on first? And this is a classic combination of toxic risk, effectively. So in other words, a vulnerability that's publicly exposed is going to be something higher likelihood. Something that's got access to data is higher impact. So bringing in those different brackets of exposure, exploitability, impact, higher identity, being able to prioritize those is kind of a key, I'd say, first step when it comes to that new operating model, right? The visibility and the prioritization. Then you got to.
I can say 100%, and it's something that we don't always know as well. So having a tool like Wiz, or having something where you've got that idea of, oh, okay, this is a different lens on something that we might have missed. That's sort of not with our own blinders, can be really important and really useful to help say, okay, do this, not that.
Yeah, interesting. And you kind of got that threat intel over the top of it to tell you what the combinations you've got to be looking out for are. Then we move into that kind of operating model side of things. Now, when you've got a multi-cloud or potentially just large cloud environment, you can have different application layers and different services, whether it's, one team has 3 accounts and another team, or it could be based on tags. I'm actually not sure how amaysym's doing it. Ownership becomes key, because as you would have seen there, like how they own their own infrastructure, it's important that they can see their own alerts, whether it's sent to them, but more importantly, they've got the ability to go into the platform and see a relevant view of their environment, their risks associated. And there's a few reasons for this. One, role-based access control. People should only see what they need to see. Number 2, adoption always drops when people see something that's slightly irrelevant to them. If there's one thing that it's what we see typically. So just present people what they need to know, ultimately. And then obviously, when it comes to workflows, automation. I know you're kind of in this journey of potentially like doing direct automations when it comes to Wiz, but we like to send the alerts how the teams actually like to operate. If they're a Slack team, Jira, you can automate these alerts. There's no point kind of imposing unnecessary extra tooling or processes if you can avoid it. And I presume that's kind of a similar methodology that you'll...
Yeah, 100%. Like, there's things that we want to send to a SOC for maybe deeper analysis or something like that, but there's no point sending a vulnerability in a piece of code that we know is public to a SOC for then it to be assigned to a developer to fix it. We may as well send that straight to the developer in the way they want to fix it as well.
Yeah.
So having that different paths to say this type of issue goes here versus this type of issue goes this way was really important for us.
From like a risk domain and all that type of thing as
yeah.
well. And then, once you've kind of removed, and then as I mentioned, the severity matrix that we like to focus on is around risk. It's not around the CVSS score. It's not around how bad a misconfiguration is. They're obviously all factors to the decision. Ultimately, you need to bring it all up, and critical issues are critical issues. They are technically high likelihood, high impact. Now, once you've kind of got to that runtime state at a lower risk level, it doesn't mean like kind of cloud's done, we've fixed it. It's an evolving journey and all that type of thing. Ultimately, what we start to see is a shift left approach, which I know is a classic buzzword when it comes to DevSecOps, but ultimately being able to use those runtime insights and potentially embed, let's see if this, yeah, we got something going, and introduce guardrails when it comes to deployment pipelines. So, you've kind of cleaned up the house, why not maintain it by introducing preventative measures, as well as potential self-service assessment capabilities. So the developer, before they've even tried to commit something, can self-assess and say, is this going to be out of policy? Is this going to be, non-compliant to our particular regulatory compliance frameworks, for example? I know I don't think we've dived too deeply in DevSecOps with amaysim, but is this an avenue where you're kind of focusing on from a guardrails perspective?
Yeah, no, so something that we really want to bring to bear in the coming year is making sure that we're fixing things that aren't there yet. What we've focused on so far, which has been really good, is looking at our production environments and what's actually running. But then it's the next stage to go, okay, how do we mature and ensure that the things that we're building next have the right guardrails in place rather than just blockers or process gates or anything like that, to allow our teams to do their best work, but also not expand our risk posture, because security is just risk management in a way. We're choosing to say, this is how we mitigate the risk.
This is how we're going to do it.
Yeah.
I heard you earlier say around the risk prioritization. Are you seeing risk prioritization, but also security not being a blocker? Tell us a little bit about, as much as you can share. Is security still a blocker within amaysim? Are we seeing it as a different function? How's it viewed?
So we've been growing our security function over the last few years, but our culture really doesn't tolerate blocking actions. We really tolerate working collaboratively, which is probably a little bit of a secret sauce at amaysim as well, as that culture and that collaborative approach. So that became really key in how we did process or platform selection. It's why it took us a while to choose a tool like this, and why we're sort of really cautious to say, okay, if we're going to do something which will change the developer experience, how do we make sure that we're not unnecessarily adding weight or process that doesn't make sense, that doesn't resonate, and in the end doesn't necessarily make us more secure as well.
It's interesting, and obviously we're not the only cloud security vendor out there, so I can imagine you're getting inundated with a lot of different... Still are, yeah, I'm sure. Outside of technical validation, when you mention like people and process elements, what are you looking for in a supplier like Wiz? Like what were some of the conditions when you're evaluating?
I think there are a few security standards to choose from, and there's a few risk frameworks to choose from as well. Having a vendor solve that problem a little bit for us, to say, okay, if you've chosen this framework, here's how you can start to validate it, and not have it as a huge cost to change that if you need to. If you, for example, get bought by someone and the risk framework has to change, that can help. But yeah, really trying to make sure that our processes are as lightweight as possible and really fit for purpose as well.
Fantastic. Well, I'll kind of start to wrap things up here. So, as I mentioned, Wiz is a agentless platform built on AWS. Locally, we've got a bunch of customers that we're happy to kind of talk through, like amaysim, that are really advanced in their operating model and how they're operating with cloud, and helping change that kind of dynamic between security and developer friction. Because ultimately what we see, like with amaysim, when you kind of synergize that, and it's not just due to Wiz that they've got a really nice collaborative culture at amaysim with a tech-driven focus, but many other organizations are kind of going down that journey in different stages, and how you can synergize them and then turn security into a bit of an enabler for adoption, like new services being like AI and all these types of things. How do you bring it in together from the ideation stage to have security as kind of front of mind, but also part of the conversation in that design process? So we'll be kind of outside. I'll kind of leave it there. I think there's some surveys that you can take of it, but Peter and I will be just out front. We've also got a Wiz booth somewhere around there. People are kicking a soccer ball somewhere around there, so that's how you can find us. I suppose thank you very much. Peter, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think exclusive of Wiz, I think as a technology team at amaysim, we really try and drive and shape business outcomes. I'd really encourage any of you that are in those kind of roles to really build that into your process, whether you're choosing a vendor or building a new widget or choosing to buy a new widget from someone. Really ensure that you're looking at those business outcomes, and then what that tool, process, or software pattern is going to help you achieve, and how it's going to help you achieve it, rather than getting bogged down into the achievement. And that's where I think success with the various platforms will help. And that's whether it's security or anything else in the cloud ecosystem, I'd say.
Yeah, really well said. Thank you very much, Peter. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, and we'll be outside. Thanks. You. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.